A photo that was taken at a place called Longwood Gardens. So the thing that happened to me is that when I made this decision to get into infrared photography, because again, I was sort of like looking for something else to sort of kick it up a notch, do something different. And I'm always sort of doing things like that. And I went and I got the camera converted, and I actually converted a DSLR called it Nikon D2X, because I had just gotten the D3X. So that is really still the camera I use today for my professional work. And I took my D2X and I said, well, I'm going to convert it. Now, the conversion was interesting because I sent the thing out, and, although it sounds all good in theory, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to do this infrared photography. One of the main things that not that I didn't realize, but it was the timing was way off, because when you do infrared photography, and the reason I start with this photo is you'll notice all the leaves look white. So when I had my camera converted, I actually got it, I think it was the weekend of like Thanksgiving. So that's like late November. All the leaves are gone off of the trees. And the reason that this happens, the reason that the leaves become white, it's because of the chlorophyll. So the chlorophyll actually turns white with infrared. So that was one of my big learning curves. So now here I am with this infrared camera, and all these, really exciting looking photos that you tend to see have that green foliage in them. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that and how to sort of start to see an infrared, if you will, and what you're going to look for, and then choosing the different filters, etc. So what is infrared photography? So all of your digital cameras actually have a filter that has an infrared blocker. So basically what they do is they modify the sensor, and they remove that filter, and they put a different kind of filter in. So what'll happen is when you decide you're going to do this, I personally used a company called LifePixel. I have no affiliation with them, so I'm not like pushing their products, but they were pretty helpful, and they have a lot of information on their website. So that's lifepixel.com, I guess. Tons of information, a lot of webinars and things like that that will kind of guide you as to what type of infrared filter you should be putting into your camera. So why do we love infrared? So one of the things that we love about infrared is that it makes blue skies black. Okay, so when we're looking at those black and white images specifically, and we will talk about color infrared, but what I have found for me personally is that even though there is this ability to have, the color infrared or a color in it, it doesn't always work for all photos. Although I do have a few that are just like some of my favorite photos that I've ever taken. So those are converted. They're basically taken it, and the color channels are swapped in Photoshop. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it, so it won't be a mystery to you. So one of the attractions is that black looking sky. And then the other thing is making foliage look white. So when you see these photos, it almost looks like there's snow on the trees. And that really kind of makes people stop, because they know it's different. They're not exactly sure why it's different, but it actually does really look a lot different, and really kind of stops people in their tracks. One of the other things that, and I don't have an example here because I don't personally do a lot of portraits, and I actually had a photo of one of my sons that I had taken, and I can't for the life of me find it, but we'll talk about backing up later. I can't find this photo, but basically what happens is when you use an infrared camera on a person, it actually makes skin look milky white, yeah, like milky, and you can almost see like I have, pretty fair skin. You can see the veins in my wrist, but when you shoot with infrared, it almost like sees like another layer or two below that. And so now if you wanted that look, so the picture I had of my son was also very fair. He had veins. I mean, it was a scary looking photo almost, but there are times when they use infrared photography in wedding photography, believe it or not. Now, obviously you're not going to have a bride that's all veiny looking because she's not a young kid, but but the bride's skin will look very milky. So that's one of the things that you may, like you could just Google like infrared wedding photography, and it's kind of like a thing. It has this very soft, romantic kind of look to it. So people like it for that type of thing. And then, you need to be using a DSLR camera. So even though you may have software programs that say, hey, here's the infrared filter. So one of the programs that I'll recommend you to use, like as an adjunct to converting your photos to black and white, is a program called Silver Effects. Now, Silver Effects is made by a company called DxO. Silver Effects has been around for probably at this point 15 years. And it was actually made by a company called Nik, N-I-K. Nik Software then sold the technology to Google because in all honesty, the Nik software, it was clunky. And there were lots of times where I was constantly fixing people's computers because Lightroom wouldn't see it and Photoshop wouldn't see it. So they had a tough time with it. Ultimately, they wound up selling it to Google. Google took that information and created what you now know as Snapseed. They took that, they made it free for everybody, and then they dumped it. And DxO, which is another very big software company, they bought it. So you can actually purchase it. It's relatively inexpensive. I think I just bought the whole suite for like $70. So and I'm not a big, if you go onto my website or you look at my photos, I'm not a big filter program, software, make my photos look like something that they're not. However, for certain things that I need, I love those programs. So big fan of DxO, because you'll find that, if you're venturing into this whole photography thing, it's a whole bunch of different softwares. Everybody wants to sell you software. So we ultimately need to convert our cameras. So we have to have the camera converted. And depending on what your choices are or what you think you want, you will make a choice on that filter, and then you'll get an estimate as to how much it costs. I was telling David, when we first signed on, I think when I did my camera, which is a DSLR, it was about $300 to $350, something like that. And then the other thing that happens if you're going to use a DSLR, now you can use a point and shoot, and lots of people love that. I would say to you that if you're going to use a point and shoot, use a point and shoot that can record raw files. So you're going to get a better quality file out of it. So one of the things that you'll find is that the post-production gets to be a lot of what goes on in the infrared photo. And if you're doing a DSLR, if you're going to convert a DSLR, you actually have to give the company your lens that you think you're going to use most with it, because then they calibrate it, because remember, they're moving the sensor around, they're putting a filter over the sensor, so they have to calibrate the lenses. So that's something, to keep in mind, because you want it to be with the lens that you want to use all the time, but you don't want to be without your lens for a couple of weeks. So that was a little bit of an issue for me. And then I find that I actually wound up selling the lens that I had, and then I'm using a similar lens. And you'll see the last thing here where it says some lenses have hot spots. And what I find with this different lens that I'm using with my infrared camera is, depending on the focal length I'm at, if I'm shooting ultra wide on it, so it's a 24 to 70, and it's remember, it's a crop sensor, so it's 24 to 70. So if I'm at 24, every once in a while, depending on where it is that I'm shooting, I'll see a hot spot, and it's basically like a circular spot. So I personally have to be mindful of that, but it's a thing, just so you know. So here is, if you go onto LifePixel's website, this is what they're going to show you. They're going to show you that, these are normal cameras, and then these are the different on the left-hand side. It says deep black and white IR, standard IR, enhanced IR, super color IR. And then you'll see that when you choose whichever filter you choose all the way to the left, they tell you what the effect will ultimately be. So you'll see that you'll have a red and blue channel swap. That's, you know, something we'll talk about. Then you'll see desaturated in Photoshop. If you're using Lightroom and or the Silver Effects program, what you would really be doing is, if you want a black and white looking infrared photo, you will be bringing it either into Lightroom and you can, you know, monkey around with it there, or you can use the Silver Effects, which is what I do. And then they show you, you know, straight from camera, auto white balance not recommended. And we'll talk about white balance also, because it's something to consider, you know, as you're doing these. So you're going to see this thing, you're going to go, geez. And when I tell you that I kept looking at this thing and going, well, what do I want? What do I want? And I picked it apart and I picked it apart. I ultimately chose enhanced IR. That was the one that I thought suited me best, because I felt like the super color, I was going to wind up with very yellow looking foliage if I did the blue channel swap, the red blue channel swap. And that's not what I wanted. I wanted to retain as much of the white that I could, and I wanted to make sure that when you look at, if you look at the black and whites on the right hand side, or to the right of that, when you look through those, when you look at super color IR and you see the black and white conversion, you'll see that it's a little flat looking. So it's a little bit on the flat side, whereas the one right above it has a little more contrast, meaning that the whites are whiter and the blacks are blacker. And if you look at the standard IR, it's probably maybe a touch better on the black and white, but not as good on the color. So for me personally, I chose the enhanced IR. I tell this to you because I have a lot of students, you know, I've been doing this a long time, a lot of people from all walks of life. And I had a woman who went and she had it converted. She didn't know, and she did deep black and white IR. So she wasn't ever able to get that color. And you're going to see a few of my color photos and they're super cool. So she was so disappointed. She's like, do I redo it? I was like, oh, I don't know if it's really worth it, if they'll even do it. So just be mindful of that. If you think that you like the color thing, you want to make sure that you either choose, you know, the standard IR, enhanced IR, or whatever, you know, suits you the best. So one of the things that, you know, people will say to me is, okay, so now I've converted my camera to infrared, and how do I expose for it? And they basically, as far as the exposure goes, the exposure is going to be kind of the same. Like, you know, that doesn't change. Aperture, shutter speeds, ISOs, all this business still applies. But that being said, I feel it's my responsibility to make sure that you all know exactly how to read your histogram and understand what it is. So your histogram is basically your camera, your photo in a graph. Okay, and you'll see this histogram when you play back your photos. Some cameras will give you a live view of it. If it's like more of like a point and shoot camera, you'll see a live view of the histogram, but it jumps all over and it's not very useful. But when you play back the photo on the camera, you will see this histogram. When you bring it into Lightroom, you'll see the histogram. When you bring it into Photoshop, the histogram. So why is this histogram so important, and what am I supposed to do about it? So if we look at the very top histogram, or any of these histograms, mainly what you want to know and understand about your histogram is that all the way to the left are the blackest blacks, the darkest areas of the photo. All the way to the right are the whitest whites. All the peaks and valleys in between are just the tonality of your photo. So it's not the color, although you will see color histograms in programs like Lightroom. You'll see that, you know, this histogram will change depending on what the photo is. So if I have a photo of a dark black bear in the forest, well, this histogram is going to be pushed more over to the left. But if I'm taking a picture of a polar bear on the ice, well, the polar bear is going to be more to the right because there's more white and highlights in the photo. I don't really care where the peaks and valleys fall. The most important thing that you need to know and understand about that histogram is that it has to kiss up end to end. I want everything. So if you look at the third histogram, which says perfect exposure, what that means is that it dies right at the end. It doesn't shoot up the side on, like on the right-hand side, it's shooting up the side. That means that the whites are blown out. You actually didn't get any detail in the whites. If you look on the left, and it's shooting up through the side, that means that all the detail in the blacks and the shadows area and shadow areas, you don't have any detail. So you may say to me, well, but I have Photoshop, I have Lightroom, I'm shooting a raw file, isn't that recoverable? And the answer is that kind of, but really what I would rather you do is make sure that you're capturing it as best you possibly can in the camera. So although lots of us are really good at software programs, we want to be really good at the camera. If I'm really good at the camera, then I just use the software to enhance it and tweak it and fine tune it. I'm not trying to, recreate something that I screwed up. So histograms, huge, important. So when you're shooting, and depending on what type of exposure mode you're using, if you're using an automatic mode, a lot of times the camera gets a little screwed up. It doesn't know. If you're shooting things that have a lot of a lot of white or light tones in it, it confuses the camera. If you have things that have a lot of dark tones, confuses the camera. So really, for any of you, and again, I don't know where you all stand in your photography, but if you're looking to sort of, get this thing to the next level, you can't be shooting in an automatic mode. At the very least, you should be shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority. I generally, honestly, when it's my photo students, I really just teach them aperture priority, because it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. When it comes to shutter priority, I'm just choosing a different thing. I teach people aperture priority because then they choose the ISO, they choose the aperture, and the camera says, here's your shutter speed. And it keeps the exposure kind of buoyant. So you're not like way overexposed or way underexposed because you don't know which way to turn the dial. So I start everyone on aperture priority. Ultimately, I get you into manual exposure. When you're in aperture priority and you see this top histogram, which means that it's falling short, I don't have enough whites or highlights in the photo, you need to be using your exposure compensation set to the plus value. So now, how much are you supposed to go plus? Well, is it plus a third of a stop, 2/3 of a stop, a full stop? That's where, a little bit of the finesse and more learning about exposure comes into play. So the second photo, which says overexposed, meaning that it's falling short on the left, that means that the meter in the camera got confused and it's looking at something that is very light. So maybe it's snow, maybe it's you're at the beach, and it looks at it and goes, wow, yeah, it's really bright out here. Let's make it darker. So you wind up with, photos that are correct or incorrect. So you have to be using exposure compensation if you're in aperture priority. If you're shooting in manual, well, then you're just not going to zero out your meter. You're just either going to go to the plus side or you're going to go to the minus side. But you need to be like really paying attention to this. And I drive this home on every class, whether you take a Lightroom class with me or you take an infrared class with me. You having an understanding of the exposure that your camera is actually recording, especially because it's digital. Okay, so it's digital. It's not like it was film and you kind of just went and hoped for the best and said, well, I think it's okay. You actually have a reference right in front of you. You have a histogram and you have the photo. So you really should be, using exposure compensation either way. And what I tell my students is that, let's say you're shooting in aperture priority. Most cameras, there's a plus minus in a very obvious location on the outside of the camera. You don't have to dig around for it. Why do you think the camera manufacturer did that? They specifically did that because you're supposed to use it. So if it's out there on the outside, it means, hey, you're supposed to use this thing. So they're making it available to you. So that's a little bit about your exposure, but again, you want to make sure that you're exposing properly on these infrared images, like all images. So this is an interesting aspect because white balance, is there white balance? So what is white balance? So your white balance is how your camera sees and interprets white light. So normally with a regular camera, you have a white balance setting. And again, depending on how you're shooting, if you're shooting a JPEG file, well, the white balance is kind of ingrained in the file. It's recorded into the file, whereas a raw file, the white balance you can play around with. So if we look at white balance from the standpoint of a color photograph, just in your regular everyday photography, you could either choose a, white balance that is daylight. Daylight, it tends to be a little bluer. If we're inside and it's incandescent light or tungsten light, that's very yellow. So what we do is we tell the camera, in camera, we'll tell the camera, we'll use one of the presets and we'll say, this is the type of colored light that I'm shooting in. Has nothing to do with the exposure. If your photo is too light or too dark, it has nothing to do with the white balance. It means that the photo's too light or too dark because the exposure is wrong. If your photo, your color photo, not infrared, if your color photo looks too yellow or too blue, it has nothing to do with the exposure and everything to do with the white balance. It means that when the camera saw that available light and interpreted it, it may say, well, this is very yellow or this is very blue, and it may be trying to compensate for it. If you put your camera on auto white balance and you're shooting in JPEG, it's good like 20% of the time. However, the problem with white balance, and for those of you that, this is just photography information, if you're shooting JPEG files and you are shooting in tricky lighting and, let's say it's a lot of indoor stuff or whatever, you can't correct white balance on a JPEG file, can't correct it. If you decide, hey, I'm going to shoot this photo, let's say it's in a church or it's in a restaurant, the light's tricky in those situations because you can have daylight coming in, you can have incandescent light, maybe you're using a flash, using all these different light sources. So how would you choose a preset that the camera gives you? You can't. So one of the things that you'll have to learn how to do, and I bring this up because you have to do it in infrared photography, is you need to create something called a custom white balance. Your camera, every camera that's out there, whether it's point and shoot or, DSLR, has the ability to create something called a custom white balance. Now, we create the custom white balance on a color photograph by choosing the custom white balance setting, then taking something, and it's usually a white piece of paper. I don't generally like to use a gray card. I like to use a white disc. Because a gray card, I would rather you be using that for your exposure, but again, different class. You would take something white, and whatever the light is that's reflecting off of that white, you would then take a calibration. You would be literally calibrating your camera to that white in that available light. So you say, well, that's kind of interesting because, well, what happens if I'm shooting inside and now I go outside? Well, now you have to take a new custom white balance. So if you're shooting color photographs, my recommendation is always a custom white balance if you're shooting JPEG. If you say to me, but I'm shooting RAW, I'll say, well, that's fine. And you can actually totally correct your white balance when it comes to your RAW files. But the problem that I'll tell you is that sometimes it's very hard to remember color. Listen, if it's, a landscape or something, it's your interpretation of the color anyway. But if you're shooting something, and let's say you're taking a picture of people, it's hard to remember skin tone. So doing a custom white balance really kind of just makes it a lot easier and sort of levels the playing field so that you're telling the camera, if this white piece of paper is white, then all other colors should be correct. So when it comes to the infrared photos, we don't use white. We actually use, what they recommend is that you would use grass or green foliage as the target. So instead of using white, because remember, the infrared camera sees foliage, chlorophyll, as white. So that's how you do the custom white balance in an infrared camera. So you're going to want to do this because it'll shift the tonality as well. And it's also going to shift if you're doing the color infrared. So the black and white maybe won't make as much, it's not going to change it as much. It's a little bit of a tonal adjustment. But basically what you want to do is make sure that you are doing custom white balance on some kind of foliage. And, as far as the rest of the function of the camera, you'll see that one of the things I wrote here is that image stabilizer will still work, but that sensor cleaning thing, like most of your cameras these days have the vibration thing on the sensor. It's built into that filter that's actually blocking the infrared light. So when they take that out and put the other filter in, it doesn't work anymore. But probably your, beyond that is, you know, if you're taking apart the camera and making it infrared, sensor cleaning thing is the point is moot. So that's a little bit white balance, autofocus. Sometimes I find that on my camera, you know, it'll move around a little bit as far as the autofocus goes, but for the most part, I really never have any issue with the autofocus. But everything still looks the same. So when you're looking through the camera, you're going to be getting a view of, you know, what it looks like all the time. So that's why I say you want to start thinking in infrared. So like this particular photo, that was like a beautiful blue sky day. And then I went to a place that had all this foliage, but just like any other, you know, from a composition standpoint or anything like that, you know, you always need to be making sure that you're defining the subject. And in this particular case, if I didn't have these walkways and this other element going on, it just would have been a bunch of white stuff. So even though it looks cool because, hey, it's infrared and it's white, if I don't have a subject, it becomes a very boring looking photo. So this over here, so I just want to show you, let me just see if I can go at it this way. When you do your photos, let me just get it too. So these are all edited. What I want to show you is I'm going to show you in Lightroom. So when you take a photo with so if you convert to infrared, now those are sunspots that I meant to have there. So that's not that, you know, flaring that I was talking about with the lens. So that I wanted it to be there. But when you're shooting, this is what you see in the camera. When you play back, this is what it looks like. So then it's up to you to make a decision about, do I want to take this and I want to convert it to a black and white, or do I want to try to play around with this and make it into that blue sky, white foliage. So depending on the image, sometimes, you know, this works just like amazing. One of my, and other times it doesn't, it'll get like this photo. See, so that's color, but it's got like a very purplish kind of look to it. Here's another one. So this one is out of camera. This is literally the day that I got the camera. So it was, like I said, it was like Thanksgiving or the day after Thanksgiving. So there's no leaves on the trees. So this is the photo out of the camera. This is it with the channels switched in Photoshop. And then this is a black and white version of it. And then here is, I guess I don't have that one. What is this one? You know, so it's a lot of these kind of, you know, things. So that's what it looks like. So you have to start to learn to see in this infrared. And these were, you know, these big lilies that were the water lilies that were in the pond. It just kind of, you know, gave this, and this is like a nice park that's around here. I would never take this photograph. Like, to me, it's very like, you know, it's like a, I don't know, it's just like a snapshot. I would never take this photograph, but because I was shooting with the infrared, absolutely. So things just have a little bit of a different kind of look to them. This is at the same park, which this tree looks like it's enormous, but it's not. And actually, sadly, this tree died. I was there like a month ago, and they took it down and put a little Japanese maple there. But so this particular photo, again, was one of these photos that I loved because I had all of the white and I just happened to get that really blue sky behind it. I thought I had a black and white version of it, but you know, it just didn't really, you know, it wasn't as exciting in black and white. This is again at that same park. So one of the things that unfortunately happens for me is that if I go out shooting, and at least, you know, a year or two ago, if I go out shooting, I'm like, well, I want to take my D3X with me and my infrared D2X. And David knows because he has a D2X, but these are enormous cameras. So now I don't do that anymore. I make a cognitive decision of I'm shooting infrared today, which I think is actually better because it gets my mind into the infrared. So for those of you that like black and white photography, you know, again, you still have to start to think in black and white, you know, and because some things won't look as good in black and white. I mean, if you took a picture of, you know, a butterfly on a flower, it doesn't really look great. I mean, I guess it could be okay, but it doesn't really lend itself to that. This over here is, this is actually a mental institution that's abandoned here on Long Island. And this is, you know, one version of it, but, you know, there's a spooky appeal to it because it gets that black sky. So I'm just going to go back to my presentation here because now I can, now that I've shown you, like, you know, the different versions of this. When we talk about post-processing in Photoshop, so I, you know, give you this, you know, pretty basic, you know, here's how you flip the color channel. So when you initially bring this photo in, it has a kind of orangey look to it. So how do I make it look like this or any of the other ones that have that blue sky in it? One of the things they'll tell you is make a levels adjustment layer. Now, for those of you that have this much Photoshop knowledge or no Photoshop knowledge, these are webinars that I do like to kind of get you going, because if you have no Photoshop knowledge and you try to go into Photoshop, you get there and you're like, okay, and I do what? So it's not as user-friendly and straightforward versus Lightroom. When you use Lightroom and you bring photos in there and you start editing them, it's kind of just a bunch of sliders and you move stuff around. Photoshop's a whole other ball of wax because now I have to make things called layers, okay? And one of the things that you'll do is make something called a levels adjustment layer. And then it goes through this thing where you then invert the channels. See, it says invert channels, so you have to know where the channel mixer is, and then invert these channels. So although this seems like, oh, well, then I just do that, you have to sort of be able to like get to that spot in Photoshop, but it's not the hardest thing in the world. But basically what you're doing is you're taking the image and you're dividing up the channels, the red, the green, the blue, and you're separating all of them. And now what you're doing is you're swapping the channels this way. So you're taking the red. So when you see that very orange looking photo, you're taking the red and you're pulling it all out and you're bumping up the blue channel in that particular, you know, the output of that particular channel. So what happens is when you swap these two, you wind up with the orange looking sky now looking blue because you've taken the red out and you've put blue in. And then you do the opposite on the blue channel. You're going to go to the blue channel and you're going to, you know, take all the blue out and then put red in. So that's how you get this. So this doesn't magically happen. It has to be done in Photoshop, and you can't do it in Lightroom, because you need to have the ability to go into the channels, the red, the green, the blue, the channels of your image. So, and Photoshop's really the only program that's going to allow you to do that. So, you know, again, you don't have to, you know, go into Photoshop. In all honesty, it's rare these days that I find an infrared photo that I do this to. I kind of like the black and white, to be honest with you. I like that. It appeals to me a little bit more. Plus these, you really need the right photograph. So sometimes I just get, you know, frustrated and I'm like, well, I don't really have a really good version of this. The other thing that'll come into play when you start doing these sorts of things, because it's the color channels, if you remember that big picture of the white tree that I said just died, there were parts of that photo that I almost had to go in and make a mask of. So it's something called a mask, where I took the saturation out because it didn't pull enough of the red out. So I found myself going back in, creating something called a layer mask and that. So when you see photos and you're like, well, you know, that just happened, you know, you'll see it and you go, how did they do that? There's usually a little more finesse that's going into it. This one was just a basic channel mix, but I will tell you that the one with the tree, I spent a little bit of extra time on it because it still had too much color in the white of the tree. Not in all of it, but just like in some of the top areas. So just so you know, you might be in a little more of a, you know, editing than you necessarily bargain for if you're looking for the color version. However, if you're doing the black and white, I mean, black and white you can do if you're using Lightroom. If you're using Photoshop, it's pretty easy too. It's just, you know, the black and white filter in Photoshop. If you're using Lightroom, Lightroom comes with a bunch of presets. There's actually a preset that's called infrared. I would still yield to trying to, you know, get a trial of the Silver Effects. I think they have a 15-day trial or something, and check it out. I like it because it really, you also have something that's called control point technology, kind of like what you see on Snapseed, and a lot of, you know, phone programs have this editing now, where you kind of will click on something and then you can select an area and make it lighter or darker. The Silver Effects has this thing called control point technology. So let's say you were doing this image and you found that, you know, maybe the top of the tree was getting a little bit blown out. You could pull it back down. You could pull the brightness down on just part of the file without having to be in a Photoshop with a layer mask and all this business. So I'm a fan of it. It also has, for those of you that have shot film, which, you know, maybe some of you. So it has a lot of what they call film recipes or film types. So you can actually create this, and then you can go in and it lists, you know, if you've ever shot black and white film, if you ever shot Ilford HP5 or FP4, it's got all the Fuji films, it's got Neopan 3200. So what it'll do is it'll mimic the grain structure of those films. So sometimes we want that if we're looking for that, if we're looking for something that has, you know, the ability to look a little more authentic. And actually the other thing that it has in that program is something called analog effects, which I only just discovered recently. And it literally will make it look like you just did a real bang up job in the dark room. And it's like this, like you dripped chemicals across the picture. So if you're looking for like a lot of nostalgia, that program is really helpful. But the Silver Effects for the conversion of the infrared, I like it better than just a straight up Lightroom conversion to black and white. So this is, you know, again, the another conversion into the color, which again, it works on this one. So you see how the it down the center of the trellis, you'll see that the white doesn't look super white. It has almost like a little bit of a yellow tint to it. That was kind of what was happening in that tree photo, and that's why I'm saying I masked it out. So you can see that on the outsides, the whites look a little whiter. And again, this is, you know, the foliage. The foliage is going to take on different characteristics of white, if you will. So that, but, you know, for me, you know, this worked just fine. I liked it in color. I liked it a lot better in color than black and white. So, and like I said, this one, I don't even know that I made this into color, but you know, that being said, when you can start to see things and you go, oh, those are really going to pop. Because if I took this as a color photo, you would look at it and go, okay, next. You just wouldn't even look at it. But because it's got this extra element of these big leaves, it just looks so much more interesting. Again, kind of just a beachy photo. You can see it has a lot of grain to it. I probably put some filter program thing on it. The beach is cool for infrared photography in that it makes the sky look very dramatic, but kind of keep in mind, there's, you know, at least the beaches here on, you know, on Long Island, there's not a lot of green foliage. Some of this grass is kind of green, but it's not that same thing as being like here. So this is, again, at that Longwood Gardens, which, you know, like Edward Scissorhands was here. So, but these were cool. They didn't, yeah, and they were interesting to see as, you know, just regular green hedges, but they definitely were much more exciting to me this way. And this was one of my favorite infrared photos because, again, if you saw this in color, those leaves would be green. And this would just, you know, and you can see it's a pathway, but this is actually a very dark, it's the entrance to one of these, you know, big mansions here on Long Island. And when you're there, it just looks dark and dreary, and it's cool. And like if you had a person in there and it was some dramatic looking photo, then it works. But really, this only works for me personally anyway, in the infrared, because I can discern the trunks of the trees and the leaves. And again, we saw this one before. There's my tree. And that's, kind of the long and short of it. So what I would like to do is, I'll just go back here into Lightroom. And then this was, I want to show you this one. Okay, and again, this was something that, again, just kind of got, a little more of my attention because of what was going on in the photo. And then that's that other one. And where was that other beach one? Oh, this one. So again, the sky, this is a November sky in New York, that's what it looks like. So, but this particular photo had a little more interest to it. And then this last one, which was the first one of the presentation. Again, this thing, which is white. I mean, it's white marble, so it is sitting in the trees, and it looks pretty and it looks nice for sure. But it has a little bit more of a, kind of Lord of the Rings kind of look to it in this photo. So that's why I say, if you're looking to kind of kick it up a notch, infrared is definitely, one of those things that will kind of change your view of things. I personally I actually just bought a Polaroid camera. I bought one of the original land cameras, and it takes SX70 film with the great hopes of doing Polaroid transfers, because again, I get bored too. And boy, let me tell you, it is not, I sit there and it takes me forever, because each one of those things that pops out, it's like $2 per picture. And I sit there and I really perseverate over, am I going to take the photo this way? But with the digital infrared, we're not, it's kind of like regular digital. So if we take a bunch of bad photos, it doesn't matter. All right, so that's kind of about the end of the presentation. So I'm curious if you guys have any questions for me.
Yeah, I've got a couple. I found it quite interesting from the